Luis Carranza, known throughout Mexico as El Matador, was more than a football player. He was a demigod sculpted from grass and glory. His journey to that point was a cinematic script that the entire nation loved to retell. At the peak of his career, as captain of the national team and the ultimate idol of the country's most popular club, his every touch of the ball was a promise of hope. The stadiums trembled at the mere mention of his name, a choir of thousands of voices elevating him to a level of immortality. He was the personification of the Mexican dream, the boy who dribbled past poverty to conquer the world. If you're new here, I ask you to subscribe and help us hit our goal of 1,000 subscribers. Also, comment on which city you're watching us from. This simple gesture allows us to keep bringing stories like Luis's, which need to be told. Born in the dusty alleys of Culiacan, Sinaloa, a place where the smell of gunpowder often overpowered that of fresh food, Luis saw football as his only escape route. The violence of drug trafficking was the soundtrack to his childhood, and every day was a battle for survival. While his childhood friends were seduced by the easy and dangerous power of the cartels, Luis's loyalty belonged to a worn-out leather ball. His talent was raw, wild, a force of nature that turned him into a local legend, even before he was old enough to sign a professional contract. He didn't just play to win, he played to live, to erase the memories of a past that insisted on haunting him. For the Mexican people, Carranza was a mirror in which everyone wanted to see their reflection. He represented overcoming adversity, the living proof that it was possible to be born in darkness and still find the light. His image was plastered on the murals of poor neighborhoods, his name chanted by children kicking tin cans as if they were golden balls. He wasn't just an athlete. He was a symbol of resistance against a fate that seemed sealed for so many. Every goal he scored was not just a point on the scoreboard, but a blow against despair, a declaration that talent and determination could indeed rewrite the story of a man and perhaps of a nation. Away from the floodlights and the roar of the crowd, Luis's life unfolded in a luxurious mansion in Mexico City, a palace of glass and marble that stood in violent contrast to the dirt floor house of his childhood. There, he found refuge in the arms of his wife, Elena, the only person who knew the man. Behind the myth, she was his anchor, his moral compass, the guardian of his humanity. In the silence of their home, El Matador would take off his hero's armor and become just Luis, a man who carried the weight of millions of expectations on his shoulders, a burden that was beginning to become unbearable and to corrode the peace he had fought so hard to build. The pressure was a slow, constant poison. Every match was a trial, every mistake amplified by the media and the fans. The fear of failing, of returning to poverty, of becoming a footnote in the history of the sport, consumed him from the inside. The adoration that fed him also imprisoned him. On sleepless nights, he would wander through his lavish home, feeling like an imposter in his own life. The pure joy of playing football was gradually being replaced by a paralyzing anxiety. He would look in the mirror and see not the idol, but a man terrified by the possibility of losing everything that had become his identity, his reason for being. Even at the top of the world, the shadows of Culiacan reached him. The past, which he believed he had left behind, had long and persistent tentacles. Figures from his youth, men whose names were whispered with a mixture of fear and respect, resurfaced like ghosts. They were the godfathers of the neighborhood, the cartel bosses who watched him grow up. They sent him expensive gifts, reminders of his roots, gestures that seemed well-intentioned but were in fact invisible. Chains, subtle reminders that no one, not even a national hero, ever completely escapes the place they came from. These connections were a dangerous secret, a stain on his immaculate biography. His coach, Javier El Profe Morales, A father figure who had guided him since the beginning of his professional career was the first to notice the cracks in the facade of perfection. He saw beyond the goals and the victories. In training, he noticed a distant look, a tension in Luis's shoulders that wasn't there before. El Profe saw the darkness gathering in his star player's eyes, a loss of focus that worried him deeply. His attempts to get closer, to offer help, were met with defensive hostility. Carranza was isolating himself, building walls around himself, not realizing he was trapping himself inside with his demons. The apex of his glory, ironically, was the prelude to his fall. The final of the national championship, the Azteca Stadium pulsating with more than 100,000 souls. In the last minute of extra time, with the score tied, Luis Carranza receives the ball. He runs, dribbles past 1, 2, 3 opponents, and with the lethal precision that earned him the nickname El Matador, he shoots for the top corner. The winning goal. The explosion from the stadium is deafening. As the nation celebrated its hero, no one could have imagined that this moment of ecstasy was, in fact, the last gasp of his innocence, the exact point at which his soul would begin to be auctioned off to the devil. The glory of a hero can unravel in the blink of an eye, in the sound of a bone snapping. It was during a crucial World Cup qualifying match, with the entire country holding its breath, that Luis Carranza's fate was sealed. A violent tackle, a disloyal and ruthless challenge from behind. The hollow sound of the impact echoed across the field, louder than the crowd's cheers. Luis collapsed on the grass, but the pain he felt was not just physical. It was the pain of the soul, the instant and terrifying realization that something irreparable had happened. As the medics rushed towards him, he looked up at the sky, and for the first time in years, the invincible idol tasted the bitter tang of pure fear, the certainty that his pedestal was crumbling beneath his feet. The diagnosis, delivered in a cold and impersonal hospital room, was a death sentence for his career, a complete tear of the knee ligaments. The doctors, with their pitiful glances and technical jargon, spoke of a long, uncertain and likely incomplete recovery. Conventional surgery might allow him to walk normally, but the explosiveness and agility of El Matador would forever be a memory. The club directors, who once treated him like a king, now visited him with vague promises and a clear reluctance to finance an experimental and extremely expensive treatment in the United States, his only real chance of a triumphant return. Luis was alone, a broken piece that the system was already preparing to discard. The days that followed were a dive into an abyss of despair. Confined to his mansion, which now felt like a golden prison, Luis was haunted by the ghosts of his own achievements. He watched his goals on television, the image of an agile and powerful man he no longer recognized. Elena tried to reach him, but he was lost in a labyrinth of anger and self-pity. The idea of losing everything, the fame, the money, the status, and being forced to return to the nothingness from which he came was a torture that gnawed at him. The humiliation of being forgotten was a fear greater than any physical pain, and this dread began to open doors in his mind he had sworn to keep locked forever. It was in this vacuum of hope that the past extended its hand. A call from an unknown number, a voice he hadn't heard since his adolescence in Culiacan, arranged a meeting. The man waiting for him at a remote ranch, disguised as a luxury horse farm, was Ricardo El Tío Velasco, the leader of the Sinaloa Cartel. He wasn't the monster Luis had imagined. He was an older, charming man with a paternalistic smile. He spoke of pride, of how Luis was a treasure of Sinaloa. He offered him the cure, the most expensive treatment in the world, not as a business deal, but as a gift from an admirer. In return, he only asked for gratitude and loyalty, a helping hand extended from hell. Luis looked at the promise of salvation, knowing perfectly well the price it would demand. It was a Faustian pact, a moral crossroads from which there would be no return. On one side, the end of his career and humiliation. On the other, an eternal debt to the most dangerous men in Mexico. He thought of his family, of the future he had promised them, of the luxurious life that had become indispensable. The fear of losing it overcame the fear of evil. He accepted. In that moment he decided he would no longer be a victim of the system or of fate. He would do whatever it took to rise again. If you've ever felt trapped and understand the desperation that drives a man to cross the line, subscribe to the channel, because it's your strength that allows us to tell the truth behind fallen heroes. The surgery, performed at an elite clinic in Texas, was a resounding success. El Tio's money bought the best technology and the most renowned surgeons in the world. Luis Carranza's recovery was classified by the sports press as miraculous, a testament to his superhuman willpower. Within a few months, he was back in training, stronger and faster than before. To the world, it was the comeback story of the year. To Luis, it was the first payment on a debt he was only beginning to understand. Every painless step on his reconstructed knee was a silent reminder of who had made it possible, an echo of the pact he had sealed in the shadows, far from the eyes of the public that idolized him. His return to the pitch was glorious. In his first game, he scored 2 goals, silencing the skeptics and reaffirming his legendary status. The nation celebrated, but Luis felt a cold emptiness amid the euphoria. The pure joy he once felt had been replaced by a mechanical efficiency. He played with the urgency of a man who needed to prove his worth, not to the fans, but to his new and dangerous sponsor. He was a more valuable product than ever, and his performance on the field was the guarantee that El Tio's investment had been worthwhile. Glory now had a different taste, metallic like money and bitter like the fear taking root in his heart. The first favor came subtly, almost casually, an invitation to a party at El Tio's ranch. Luis was instructed to be himself, to smile for the cameras, to shake hands with certain businessmen and politicians present. He felt like a trophy on display, his image as a national hero being used to legitimize men whose fortunes were built on the blood and suffering of others. He rationalized the act, telling himself it was just one night, a small price for his career. However, upon returning home, the smell of expensive cigars and imported perfume could not mask the stench of corruption that now clung to his skin. Soon after, the contracts arrived. Impeccably dressed lawyers representing El Tio presented Luis with sponsorship deals from front companies. Import-export firms, construction companies, agribusinesses, all serving a single purpose: to launder the cartel's dirty money. Millions of dollars flowed through his bank accounts before being redirected to tax havens. Luis Carranza, the idol, had become a crucial cog in the vast financial machine of drug trafficking. He signed the papers, his heart pounding, trying not to think about the origins of those fortunes. But with each signature, he felt a piece of his soul being irrevocably sold. Guilt was a poison he tried to dilute with luxury. He bought an even bigger house, sports cars that barely fit in the garage, dazzling jewelry for Elena. He showered her with gifts in a desperate attempt to justify his actions, to materialize the good that supposedly came from his choices. If his family was happy and secure, perhaps the moral sacrifice was worth it. Elena at first was dazzled, but she was no fool. The source of this new and sudden flood of wealth seemed inexhaustible, and more importantly, inexplicable. Her initial joy began to give way to a seed of suspicion, an inquisitive look that Luis tried harder and harder to avoid. Elena's questions started subtly, then became more direct. "Where is all this money coming from, Luis? Who are these men you're meeting with?" His answers were evasive, angry. He accused her of not trusting him, of not appreciating everything he did for the family. The tension between them grew, turning the mansion that should have been a sanctuary into a silent battlefield. The love that united them began to be eroded by the weight of his secrets. Every lie he told was another brick in the wall he was building between them, isolating himself in his own prison of gold and fear. At the club, El Profe Morales watched his protégé with growing concern. The sparkle in Luis's eyes had vanished. On the field he was lethal, but off it he was a haunted man. The coach tried to talk to him, to approach him like the father he had always been. "What's happening to you, son? You don't smile anymore." Luis's response was cold and harsh, an order for the coach to mind the tactics and leave him alone. The rejection deeply hurt Morales, who understood that his star player's problem was much bigger than a simple dip in form. He was losing the boy he had helped raise to a darkness he could not name. Meanwhile, in a noisy newsroom in Mexico City, investigative journalist Marco Reynoso was sniffing out his next big story. He didn't care about Carranza's goals, but about the numbers. A new main sponsor for the club, a logistics company that appeared out of nowhere, caught his attention. Reynoso, a veteran bloodhound, began to pull at the thread. He spent sleepless nights sifting through business records, cross-referencing information, feeling that behind the miraculous comeback of the country's biggest idol, there was something rotten, a story far more complex and dangerous than the public imagined. El Tio's demands became bolder. It was no longer just about laundering money or using his image. One night, Luis was ordered to use his private jet, a gift from the cartel itself, to transport a suitcase from Culiacan to Miami. He refused, panic seizing him. It was the first time he said no. El Tio's response came in the form of a photo sent to his phone. Elena and his son leaving school, seen through the crosshairs of a rifle scope. The message was clear. There was no longer a choice. Trembling, Luis made the call and authorized the flight, understanding that his life and his family's now belonged to the cartel. The point of no return, however, was even more brutal. To seal his loyalty, El Tio took him to an abandoned warehouse in the Sonoran desert. There, tied to a chair, was a man, a cartel member accused of betrayal. Luis was forced to watch as the man was tortured and executed in cold blood. The smell of blood and gunpowder made him vomit. The image of the lifeless body, discarded like trash, would be forever seared into his mind. El Tio placed a hand on his shoulder with the same paternalistic calm as always and said, "Now you are one of us, Matador. Welcome to the family." In that instant, Luis knew he was irredeemably lost, his soul stained forever. Paranoia set in like a fever. He saw threats on every corner, in every unfamiliar face in the crowd. He installed a military-grade security system in his house, but felt no safer. Sleep became a rare luxury, and when he managed it, he was tormented by nightmares of the man in the warehouse. The pressure turned him into an irritable and volatile man. He yelled at Elena for trivial reasons, distanced himself from his teammates, living in a constant state of alert. The double life was tearing him apart, and the hero beloved by Mexico was slowly dying, giving way to a frightened and cornered creature. I would look at everything I had conquered in my trophy room and only see the price I had paid. Every golden cup, every shining medal felt like a stain on my soul, a reminder of the deal I made. The journey to the top of the world had, paradoxically, led me to the darkest pit a man can know. I was a king in a castle of sand, and the tide of truth was rising. Subscribing to this channel is a way to ensure that other stories like mine are not forgotten, showing everyone that the path to glory can sometimes be the darkest and loneliest of all. Marco Reynoso's investigation began to bear fruit. He managed to connect the logistics company sponsoring the team to other front businesses of the Sinaloa cartel. He published his first piece, a bold article that, without naming Carranza, questioned the origin of the club's financial miracle and the integrity of its new business partners. The report sent shockwaves through the backrooms of Mexican football, and Reynoso's name began to be whispered with a mixture of admiration and fear. He had poked the hornet's nest, and the consequences would be unpredictable. The backlash from the article enraged El Tío. Discretion was the golden rule of his business, and media attention was a danger he could not tolerate. In a tense meeting, Velasco's benevolent mask fell away completely. He grabbed Luis by the collar, his face transformed by a cold fury, and blamed him for the exposure. "You and your fucking fame brought this vulture to my backyard," he snarled. The threats, once veiled, were now explicit. Luis's life depended on his ability to control the situation and silence the meddling journalist who threatened to expose the entire scheme. The mission was clear. Luis was to use his status and charisma to neutralize Marco Reynoso. He arranged a meeting with the journalist at a discreet restaurant, carrying a briefcase full of money. He tried to appeal to reason, talking about the risks, about the powerful people Reynoso was angering. He offered the bribe as compensation for the work already done. The journalist listened in silence, his gaze fixed and filled with contempt. In the end, Reynoso simply pushed the briefcase back and said, "Your soul might have a price, Carranza. Mine doesn't." The refusal was a slap in the face, a confirmation that the nightmare was far from over. At home, catastrophe loomed. During one of Luis's absences, Elena, driven by an unbearable anguish, searched his office. Hidden in a false bottom, she found what she had feared: a burner phone and a small ledger with names and figures she didn't understand, but which her gut told her were dirty. When Luis arrived, she confronted him, not with anger, but with the desperation of a woman watching the man she loved drown. She begged him to go to the police to seek protection. In a choked voice, he confessed the terrible truth. "If I talk, they'll kill us, Elena. They'll kill us all." To make matters worse, a cartel war broke out. A rival group seeking to expand its territory began attacking El Tío's interests in the capital. A car bomb exploded in front of a restaurant where Luis had dined the week before. The explosion was a direct message to Velasco, but the chill ran down Carranza's spine. He was no longer just a financial accomplice. He was in the middle of a crossfire, a potential target. The violence he thought he had left behind in Culiacan had returned to his life, closer and more lethal than ever. At the club, El Profe took a drastic step. Seeing his players' deplorable mental state, his free-falling performance, and the rumors that were beginning to circulate, he decided to bench Luis for an important game. His intention was to protect him, to give him time to recover. But Luis, in his paranoid state, saw the act as a betrayal. He confronted the coach, screaming in front of the entire squad and the press, accusing him of envy and trying to destroy his career. The scandal was immense, and the last bond of affection and protection Luis had was severed forever. Marco Reynoso's persistence finally paid off with a valuable source, a federal police officer frustrated with internal corruption who had been investigating the Sinaloa cartel for years. The source confirmed the journalist's suspicions and provided crucial pieces of the puzzle, including details of bank transactions that directly linked Carranza's accounts to the money laundering network. Reynoso now had the weapon he needed. He no longer had just a theory, but concrete proof to bring down the biggest idol in Mexican sports and expose the symbiosis between football and organized crime. With the police and the press closing in, El Tío changed Luis's role. He was no longer just the pretty face or the bank account. Now he was an inside agent. Velasco demanded detailed information about the team's routine, flight schedules, hotels where they stayed, bus routes, security flaws. Luis became a spy within his own sanctuary, providing data that could be used for kidnappings, extortion, or something even worse. With every piece of information passed, he felt the betrayal corrode what little remained of his character. Crossing lines he never imagined, in his worst nightmares, he would cross. The final blow to his personal life came in the form of a letter left on the perfectly made bed. Elena was gone. Unable to continue living the lie and fearing for her children's safety, she had taken them and disappeared without a trace. "I will always love you, Luis," the letter read, "but I cannot let our children grow up in the shadow of your monsters. I pray that one day you find your way back." The pain of the loss was overwhelming, far worse than the knee injury. He had sold his soul to protect his family, and now, because of it, he had lost them forever. Without Elena, Luis completely crumbled. He turned to drink, seeking refuge in alcohol from the pain and guilt that consumed him. His discipline, once legendary, evaporated. He would show up to training hungover if he showed up at all. On the field, he was a pathetic shadow of El Matador. The fans, who once revered him, now booed him mercilessly with every mistake, every misplaced pass. The hero fell from his pedestal in a freefall, and the sound of the impact was a symphony of thousands of voices that once chanted his name in adoration, now cursing him in unison. Marco Reynoso was ready for the checkmate. With the testimony from his police source and the bank records, he wrote the story of his life, a detailed exposé with names, dates, and figures that unraveled the entire web of corruption, linking Luis Carranza, the nation's hero, directly to Ricardo El Tío Velasco and the Sinaloa Cartel. He informed his editor, who, aware of the danger, prepared a special security plan for the publication. The bombshell was about to drop, and the shockwave promised to shake the country's foundations. Feeling the net closing in, El Tío Velasco became a cornered animal, and therefore even more dangerous. He no longer saw Luis as a valuable asset, but as a problem, a loose end that could bring them all down. The admiration he once felt for the player had turned into contempt. In their conversations, the paternalistic tone gave way to a cutting coldness. Luis felt the danger emanating not just from rival cartels or the police, but from his own godfather. He knew his usefulness was coming to an end, and in the world of drug trafficking, the end of usefulness usually meant the end of life. On the eve of the championship final, the final blow was delivered. El Tío summoned Luis for one last meeting in an isolated and grim location. The conversation was brief and brutal. The cartel had bet tens of millions of dollars on the defeat of Carranza's team. The order was simple and unequivocal. He had to throw the game. A missed penalty, a bad pass at a crucial moment, a decisive defensive error. Anything, as long as his team lost. The consequence of failure was also made clear, with a photo of Elena and his children at a playground abroad. You win, they die. The Azteca Stadium was a cauldron of passion, a monster of concrete and sound that pulsed with the energy of 100,000 hearts. For any player, that final would be the pinnacle of their career. For Luis Carranza, it was his scaffold. He walked onto the pitch under the blinding glare of the floodlights, but he felt a glacial coldness in his soul. Every chant of his name, every child's face painted with the team's colors, was a stab of guilt. He was not a hero about to fight for glory. He was a condemned man, marching to carry out the betrayal he had been ordered to commit. The weight of his impossible choice was crushing him, and the roar of the crowd sounded like the prelude to his own execution, regardless of what he did. The opening whistle sounded like a starting gun for his personal hell. In the first few minutes, Luis played like a ghost. His passes, normally precise, went astray. He positioned himself poorly on purpose, avoided challenges for the ball, seemed slow and disinterested. His teammates looked at him with a mixture of confusion and anger. From the stands, the first boos began to emerge, timid at first, then growing louder. Every deliberate mistake was a torture, an act of public self-mutilation. The image of his family's photo, however, was burned into his mind, a constant reminder of why he was desecrating the sport he loved, killing the idol in front of the nation. 30 minutes into the second half, the inevitable happened. From a defensive lapse he himself created, the opposing team scored. The silence that fell over the stadium was profound, broken only by the small section of rival fans celebrating. Luis saw the desolation in his teammates' eyes, the hope draining from the fans. In that moment, looking at the scoreboard that decreed his defeat and therefore his survival, a terrible clarity hit him. He realized that in trying to save his life, he had already lost everything. His honor, his respect, the love of his wife and the admiration of his people. He was becoming the coward El Tio wanted, and the realization filled him with an unbearable self-loathing. It was then that something inside him broke. A primal fury, born of absolute despair, took over his body. He stopped playing the Cartel's game. In the final 10 minutes, Luis Carranza transformed. The ghost gave way to El Matador in his purest, wildest form. He ran like a madman, fought for every ball as if his life depended on it, and in fact it did. It was no longer about winning or losing, about living or dying. It was about one last act of rebellion. It was about choosing how his story would end. He would rather die as the hero everyone believed him to be than live another second as the puppet he had become. The clock showed the last minute when the ball came to him, 30 yards from the goal. Time seemed to freeze. In his mind, a whirlwind of images, his children's smiles, Elena's disappointed gaze, the paternalistic and cruel face of El Tio. It was his last chance for redemption, not for others, but for himself. With a cry that was more a sob of pain than a physical effort, he struck the ball with all the strength left in his soul. It traveled through the air like a guided missile, an impossible trajectory that defied logic, and bulged the top corner of the net. Goal. The stadium erupted in a collective delirium. He had done the impossible, and he had sealed his fate. As his teammates piled on top of him in a collective hug, celebrating the unlikely hero, Luis remained motionless, his body present, but his mind miles away. He felt only a cold emptiness, the terrifying calm that precedes death. His eyes were not on the trophy or the crowd. They scanned the VIP boxes, searching for the faces of El Tio's men, knowing that the sentence had been passed the moment the ball crossed the line. The euphoria around him was surreal, the sound of celebration distorting into a low hum in his ears. He was not a champion. He was a dead man, awaiting the bullet. The retaliation was immediate and brutal. In the tunnel leading to the locker rooms, amidst the chaotic celebration, all hell broke loose. Armed men, wearing fake police uniforms, tried to kidnap him, opening fire on the team's security. The sound of gunshots turned joy into panic and horror. Amid the shootout that erupted in the stadium's corridors, Luis Carranza's double life was exposed in the most violent way possible. Wounded in the crossfire, the journalist Marco Reynoso, who had followed Luis, anticipating a confrontation, captured the scene with his camera, the hero of the final, with the champion's medal on his chest. At the center of a battle between the cartel and the law, the image that would destroy his legend forever. The dust from the stadium shootout had barely settled, and the myth of Luis Carranza was already dead and buried. The news exploded like a nuclear bomb over Mexico, a shockwave of shame and betrayal that swept the country. The images of the national hero in the midst of a cartel battle dominated every newscast. The nation's adoration turned into a visceral hatred overnight. His statues were defaced and torn down. Jerseys with his name were burned in public pyres, and his name was officially erased from all records and awards. The man who had united the country in celebration now united it in a unanimous feeling of revulsion. The fall was total, brutal, and without appeal. Today, Luis Carranza's world is no longer a green pitch or a marble mansion. It is a 6-by-9-foot cell in a maximum security prison. The deafening roar of the crowd has been replaced by an oppressive silence, broken only by the echo of guards' footsteps and the distant screams of other condemned men. There are no more golden trophies, only iron bars. There is no more open sky, only a small grey rectangle of light from a barred window. Stripped of his fame, his money and his family, he is just a number, a ghost haunted by the memories of a life that seems to have belonged to someone else. In the solitude of his cell, he finally has time to confront the truth of his choices. He replays every decision, every lie, every step that led him from glory to the abyss. Does he regret it? Yes, he regrets the pain he caused Elena, El Profe, everyone who believed in him. But in a dark corner of his soul, he cannot bring himself to regret that final goal. It was the only moment in a very long time that he felt free. A suicidal act of defiance that, for a single glorious second, allowed him to be the hero everyone thought he was. It was his rebellion against the devil, even if the price was eternal damnation. The legacy of El Matador became a dark fable, a cautionary tale whispered in locker rooms to promising young athletes about the dangers of unchecked ambition and the wrong company. He, who was once the example to follow, is now the example to avoid. He reached for the heavens, but he did so with wings borrowed from hell, and the fall was inevitable. The authorities never found Elena and his children, who disappeared to start a new life under another identity, protected by a witness program. Luis Carranza lost everything, and his only company now is the image of the man he once was, reflected in his tired, empty eyes. The story of Luis Carranza shows us that the fall of an idol is more than a personal tragedy. It is a symptom of a world where the pressure to succeed can corrupt even the strongest soul. His journey from the light into darkness serves as a painful mirror of the choices we all face. I thank you for staying until the end and for helping us tell these difficult truths. Your subscription to the channel is what gives us the strength to continue shining a light on the shadows, so that the dazzling brilliance of heroes never blinds us to the fragile, fallible humanity that exists behind each of them.